Some houses hold their secrets behind plaster and pine. Some secrets, once found, cannot be unfound. In the spring of 1869, a merchant from Philadelphia purchased what was described in the deed as a fully operational agricultural estate in the lowlands of South Carolina. 1,600 acres of timber, field, and still water, priced well below any comparable property in the county. The seller, a man who had inherited the land from his father and his father's father before him, signed the papers without ceremony, without sentiment, and without ever looking back at the house. He simply walked away. The new owner, a practical man by nature, arrived at Harlow Hall with a surveyor, a carpenter, and an ambition to convert the estate into something modern, something that would leave no trace of what it had been. But within 3 weeks of his arrival, the carpenter refused to continue working. He quit without explanation. He would only say, quietly, to anyone who asked, that there were things inside the walls that no Christian man should have to look upon. What those things were, and what they meant, took nearly 4 years to fully understand. And when the truth finally surfaced, it did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a reckoning. Before we continue with the story of Harlow Hall, if you're new here, welcome. This channel is dedicated to the darkest, most forgotten corners of American history. The stories that were buried, sealed, and left to rot in silence. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? To understand what was found inside those walls, you first have to understand what Harlow Hall had been. The property sat roughly 30 miles inland from the Carolina coast, far enough from Charleston's genteel streets to be insulated from scrutiny, close enough to the port to have once profited enormously from the trade it facilitated. The land had been in the Hargrove family since 1791, when a man named Edmund Hargrove received it as partial payment for a debt he was owed by a Crown loyalist fleeing north after the Revolution. Edmund had not come from wealth. He had come from ambition, which in the American South of that era was often a far more dangerous thing. By the time Edmund's grandson, Nathaniel Hargrove, inherited the estate in 1841, Harlow Hall had grown from a rough-timbered farmhouse into something considerably more imposing. The main house rose 3 stories above the flat Carolina earth, with wide verandas on the first 2 floors and a cupola at its crown that could be seen from the road nearly a mile away. The exterior was painted white, freshly, obsessively year after year, so that it gleamed in the summer heat like a thing trying too hard to look clean. The property worked between 40 and 60 enslaved people depending on the season, their numbers fluctuating with the rhythms of the rice and indigo trade. By the 1850s, the Hargrove operation had shifted predominantly to rice, which required not just labor, but specific knowledge. Knowledge that the enslaved people on the property possessed in abundance, having brought the techniques for tidal irrigation with them from the coast of West Africa over the preceding generations. The irony, understood by no one at the time and acknowledged by almost no one afterward, was that Harlow Hall's prosperity was built entirely on expertise that its owners could never have replicated on their own. Nathaniel Hargrove was, by the accounts that survived him, a methodical man. He kept ledgers. He recorded transactions with the precision of a merchant rather than the looseness of a plantation aristocrat. He noted purchases, sales, births, deaths, and punishments in the same flat, unornamented hand. His wife, a woman named her name was Dorothea, daughter of a rice merchant from Beaufort, married into the Hargrove name in 1843 at the age of 19. She bore 3 children, of whom 2 survived. She is described in a letter from a neighboring planter's wife as quiet, devout, and rather more fond of her garden than her dining room. She appears rarely in Nathaniel's ledgers and almost never in the letters that survive. Whatever she knew about what happened at Harlow Hall, she carried with her to her grave in 1891. The eldest surviving Hargrove child, a son named Warren, was 23 years old when the war ended. He had served 2 years in the Confederate Army before a fever invalided him home in 1863, and he had spent the remainder of the conflict managing the estate under the increasing strain of the blockade, the loss of markets, and the gradual dissolution of the system on which everything depended. When emancipation came, Warren Hargrove handled it in the manner of a man who had already accepted the outcome while refusing to acknowledge its implications. He paid wages, a few cents per day, to any formerly enslaved person willing to remain on the property. Most left. A handful stayed, either because they had nowhere else to go, or because Harlow Hall was, in a way they could not fully articulate, still theirs. By 1868, Warren Hargrove was deeply in debt. The rice market had collapsed. The fields required repairs he could not afford. Several of the property's outbuildings had fallen into disuse, and the main house, for all its white paint and imposing height, had begun to show the particular decay that sets in when maintenance is deferred year after year. A softening of the wood, a darkening of the mortar, a smell that no open window could entirely dispel. He sold the estate in March of 1869 to a man named Gerald Prentice, a wholesale merchant from Philadelphia who had made a considerable fortune supplying Union forces during the war and was now looking to diversify into southern land. Prentice had never seen the property before the day he purchased it. He had acted on the recommendation of a business associate who described it as distressed but structurally sound, with significant potential. The price was less than half of what comparable acreage had sold for a decade earlier. Warren Hargrove took the money, settled his most pressing debts, and relocated to Savannah. He died there in 1884. His obituary described him as a man of the Old South, faithful to its traditions. His mother, Dorothea, declined to attend his funeral, citing poor health. She was, at the time, 70 years old and had not left Beaufort in 3 years. Her reasons for the absence were never formally recorded. Gerald Prentice arrived at Harlow Hall in April of 1869 with considerable optimism and almost no understanding of what he had bought. The carpenter's name was Daniel Foss, a man in his late 40s who had followed Prentice south from Pennsylvania on the strength of a good wage and the promise of steady work through the summer. He was experienced, practical, and by all accounts not given to nervousness or superstition. He had worked in old houses before. He knew the sounds they made, the ways old wood settled and shifted in the heat. He was not, as he put it in a letter to his wife, the type to be frightened by shadows. He began the renovation in the east wing of the main house, which showed the most structural damage, and which Prentice wanted addressed before the summer humidity made conditions worse. The plan was straightforward. Remove the damaged plaster from the interior walls, assess the framing, repair what could be repaired, and replace what could not. Standard work for a man of his experience. The first wall he opened was in a room on the second floor, a room that appeared from its dimensions and location above the main entryway to have been used as a study or small library. The walls were paneled in painted pine over a plaster substrate, and when Foss began pulling the panels away from the southern wall, he found what he initially assumed was the remnant of an old modification. A section of the framing, roughly 2 feet wide and extending from floor to ceiling, had been packed tightly with material that was not insulation and not structural infill. It was paper, not loose paper, not scattered, but paper that had been compressed, folded, rolled, and forced into every available space in the cavity between the exterior wall and the interior surface. Hundreds of pieces, perhaps more. When Foss pulled the first bundle free, it crumbled partly in his hands, the edges rotted by moisture and age. But the center of each piece, protected by the compression, was largely intact. The ink was faded but legible. They were letters, or rather, they were pieces of letters, fragments of correspondence, strips of paper covered in handwriting that ranged from a careful, educated script to something that was clearly the effort of a person who had learned to write under difficult circumstances with letters that varied in size and pressure, as though the hand holding the pen had been uncertain of its right to do so at all. Foss, who was literate but not a scholar, read enough of what he held to understand that what he had found was not simply correspondence that had been forgotten. The paper had been put there deliberately, forcefully, as though someone had needed very badly to make certain that what was written on it never left that house, and had chosen the most permanent means of disposal available to them. He showed the papers to Prentice that evening. Prentice, by his own account, read 3 of the fragments before setting them down on his work table and sitting in silence for a long time. He later described the experience to his attorney in Philadelphia as discovering that the house you have purchased was built on something other than foundation stones. What those letters contained, in full, would not become clear for weeks, but the fragments Foss had retrieved that first afternoon were enough to establish certain things with certainty. The letters were addressed to multiple recipients. Some were addressed to specific individuals, some to unnamed recipients described only by role or location. Several mentioned dates spanning from the early 1840s through the mid-1860s, and one, the one Prentice read last, on a strip of paper that had been torn diagonally as though in haste, contained a single sentence that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "They do not know we keep count." Prentice did not contact the authorities immediately. This was not, as he would later explain it, out of any desire to conceal what he had found. It was, rather, that he was genuinely uncertain what authority had jurisdiction over letters hidden in a wall, or what law, if any, had been violated by their concealment. The war had ended 4 years ago. Emancipation was law. The world that had produced these documents was, legally speaking, finished. And yet, he had Foss continue opening the walls. Over the following 2 weeks, they found similar caches in 4 additional locations within the main house. Behind the plaster of the ground floor kitchen passageway, inside the frame of a sealed doorway on the 3rd floor that had been plastered over so thoroughly that no indication of its former existence was visible from either side, within the hollow base of a built-in cabinet in what had been the overseer's office at the rear of the house. And, most surprisingly, beneath the floorboards of the cupola, the small observation room at the very top of the house, where the boards had been pried up and replaced with a precision that suggested the work had been done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had time to do it carefully. The materials were not identical across all the locations. The kitchen passageway yielded primarily small objects, not letters, but items that had been carefully wrapped in cloth before being concealed. A brass button engraved on its reverse with initials that were not Hargrove initials. A folded piece of cloth that appeared to be a portion of a garment, too deteriorated to identify with certainty, but of a weight and weave consistent with workwear from the mid-19th century. 3 coins, 2 American, and 1 that Prentice could not identify. And a small wooden disc, smooth on one side and carved on the other with a pattern that none of the men on the renovation crew could name. The sealed doorway on the 3rd floor opened onto a space that was neither a room nor a passage. It was a cavity, perhaps 4 feet wide and 7 feet long, that existed between the exterior wall of the house and an interior partition that had no evident structural purpose. The space had been used. The floor of it showed clear evidence of long occupation, a worn depression in the boards, dark discoloration from what might have been a lamp or candle, a pattern of scratch marks along the lower section of the inner wall that appeared to be, on close examination, a deliberate tally. Hundreds of vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, covering an area approximately 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Someone had been counting something, methodically, patiently, over what appeared, based on the variation in the depth and angle of the marks, to have been a very long time. The cabinet in the overseer's office contained a different kind of material entirely. What Prentice found there were not letters and not objects, but what appeared to be a record, a parallel ledger, maintained in a hand that was careful and consistent, recording information in a format that deliberately echoed the plantation's official accounts. Column after column of dates, names, quantities, and notations. Not the names in Nathaniel Hargrove's ledgers. Different names, some of them given names that appeared nowhere in the official records, others described by relationship rather than name. The woman brought from the Beaufort auction. Her daughter. The child born in October not recorded. The entries were meticulous. They covered a period from approximately 1848 to 1863, when the handwriting abruptly changed, becoming slightly less certain, slightly larger, as though the person who had maintained the record had passed the responsibility to someone else. The final cache, beneath the cupola floor, was the most difficult to interpret. The papers there were more deteriorated than the others, the moisture damage more severe, the rot more advanced. Prentice and Foss spent 2 days carefully separating and drying what could be salvaged. What remained legible, when the process was complete, were fragments of what appeared to be a single long document, not a collection of separate letters, but a continuous narrative, written in a hand that was both highly educated and clearly not the hand of anyone in the Hargrove family records Prentice had been given with the deed. The narrative was in English, but it was not the English of the period's official documents. It was the English of someone who had learned the language under specific conditions, who had absorbed it, mastered it, and then used it with a precision that was, in its own way, a kind of defiance. Prentice could only read fragments, but what he read was enough to tell him that the document was, among other things, a chronicle, a deliberate, systematic account of events at Harlow Hall, spanning what appeared to be the entire antebellum period of the property's operation. He contacted his attorney in Philadelphia on a Thursday evening in late May of 1869. The letter he sent was 7 pages long. His attorney, a man named Edmund Hartwell, who had handled Prentice's business affairs for 15 years, received it on a Monday and made an immediate trip south. He arrived at Harlow Hall on a Wednesday. By that evening, he and Prentice had agreed on one thing. What they had found was not simply the detritus of a history now concluded. It was a record that someone had very deliberately preserved. And the question that neither man could answer, the question that would come to define the next 3 years of their lives, was a simple one. Preserved for whom? Hartwell, who had practiced law in Philadelphia for 20 years and had a historian's instinct for documentation, immediately recognized that the materials found at Harlow Hall were not simply historically significant, they were legally complex, in ways that the American legal system of 1869 was entirely unprepared to address. The parallel ledger was the most immediately actionable document. It recorded, systematically and with considerable specificity, a series of practices at Harlow Hall that, even under the legal framework of the antebellum South, had been of questionable legality, and that, under post-war law, pointed toward a set of facts that powerful men in South Carolina would prefer remained buried. Chief among these was the question of the unrecorded. The official Hargrove ledgers, copies of which Prentice had received with the deed, showed a consistent enslaved population at the property, numbers that matched more or less the taxes and registration records that the Hargrove family had filed with the county. But the parallel ledger told a different story. It recorded a systematic practice spanning at least 15 years. The deliberate non-registration of certain individuals, particularly children born on the property, who were instead sold privately and without official record, transactions that generated income for the Hargrove estate without leaving any trace in the official documentation. This was not in itself a revelation about the brutality of the system. The practice of unrecorded transactions was well understood by anyone who had studied the period. What made the Harlow Hall ledger remarkable was its specificity. It recorded not just the existence of these transactions but their details, prices, dates, the names of buyers, and in some cases brief notations about the individuals sold. These notations were not the detached accounting entries of Nathaniel Hargrove's official records. They were something else entirely, brief, compressed, written in a shorthand that Hartwell and Prentice spent several days learning to interpret. The key to the shorthand was found in the cupola fragments. What they had initially taken to be a continuous narrative was actually 2 interwoven documents, a chronicle of events at Harlow Hall and a cipher key, a systematic record of the notation system used in the parallel ledger. The cipher was not complex by the standards of cryptography. It was the kind of system developed by someone who needed to communicate information clearly to a specific, known readership, while keeping that information illegible to anyone outside that group. The notation that had appeared throughout the ledger as a simple dash following a name, for example, meant departed alive, destination recorded elsewhere. A small circle meant died on property, cause unrecorded. A horizontal line through a name meant sold without family knowledge. When Hartwell applied the cipher to the full ledger, the document transformed. It was not simply an accounting record, it was a map. A systematic chart of where people had gone, not the vague approximations of official records, but specific information about buyers, locations, and in some cases, subsequent sales. Information that, if it had ever reached the people it concerned, would have allowed families separated by the trade to know where their relatives had been taken. This was what they do not know we keep count had meant. Someone at Harlow Hall, someone who had access to both the official records and the transactions that never appeared in them, had been maintaining a parallel archive for over a decade, not as evidence for any court, not as ammunition for any formal challenge, but as a record kept against the possibility that it might one day be of use to the people it documented. Hartwell sat with this understanding for a long time before he spoke. "Someone in that house," he said to Prentice, on an evening in early June with the Carolina heat pressing through the unrestored windows, understood exactly what was happening. And they understood it would matter eventually, even if they had no way to know how or when. Prentice asked the question that had been forming in his mind for days. Who had that kind of access? Who could have maintained this without being discovered? Hartwell had already been thinking about this. The answer, he had concluded, was not a single person. The handwriting in the ledger changed twice over its 15-year span, subtly but unmistakably. At least 3 individuals had contributed to its maintenance, and based on the nature of the information recorded, at least one of them had to have had access to Nathaniel Hargrove's own records, either directly or through someone who did. The official Hargrove household accounts included a notation found in the ledgers transferred with the deed of a woman described as the house manager, trained in correspondence and accounts, employed from 1845. She is referred to throughout the ledger only as Nora. No surname, no age, no origin. She appears in the official records only in the context of her function, managing the household, maintaining supply inventories, occasionally recording the receipt of payments from buyers who came to the house directly rather than through formal channels. She does not appear in the ledger after February of 1863. The significance of that date would not become clear until Hartwell made a trip, in the summer of 1869, to a Freedmen's Bureau office in Columbia, one of the federal agencies established after the war to assist formerly enslaved people in establishing legal identities, locating family members, and navigating the transition to freedom. The Bureau's records were incomplete, underfunded, and overwhelmed by the scale of the need they were attempting to address. But they contained something that no one had thought to connect to Harlow Hall, until Hartwell walked in with the parallel ledger under his arm and asked to see the registration records for women who had come through the Columbia office in 1865 and 1866. He found 4 registrations that matched names from the ledger. 3 were straightforward. Individuals whose histories could be partially reconstructed from the Bureau's documents and the ledger's notations. The 4th was different. She had registered under the name Nora Hale. She had listed her former location as a rice plantation, Lowland County, South Carolina, vague by Bureau standards, which suggests she had reasons not to be specific. She had listed her skills as household management, accounting, written correspondence, and she had listed her age in 1866 as 41, which would have made her approximately 19 years old in 1845. The year the official Hargrove ledger first noted the arrival of the house manager, trained in correspondence and accounts. Hartwell found no address for Nora Hale in the Bureau records. She had registered, received her documentation, and then, as far as the Bureau's records could determine, moved on. Her destination was not recorded. The Bureau agent who had processed her registration had noted, In the margin of her file, a single observation, unusually precise in her account, gave no names of former owners, appeared aware of legal implications. She had been gone for 3 years before Prentice bought the house. She had left behind a record that she almost certainly knew would one day be found. The question was whether she had intended it to be found by someone like Prentice, or whether she had hidden it for someone who never came. The deeper Hartwell dug, the more the contours of what had happened at Harlow Hall began to take a shape that was both clearer and more troubling. In the late summer of 1869, he traveled to Charleston and spent 2 weeks in the records of the county courthouse, cross-referencing the Hargrove family's official transaction records against property transfers, estate inventories, and court filings from the period covered by the parallel ledger. He was looking for the buyers, the names recorded in the ledger's cipher, the men who had come to Harlow Hall and left with individuals who appeared in no official record. Some of the names he could not trace. They appeared in no Charleston records, no county filings, no newspaper archives. They had purchased people at Harlow Hall and vanished as completely as the people they had bought. Whether this was because they had operated entirely outside the legal system, or because records from certain counties had been destroyed during the war, or because the names recorded in the ledger were aliases rather than legal names, Hartwell could not determine with certainty. But other names were traceable, and several of them were significant. One appeared 4 times in the ledger, each time associated with a transaction involving a child rather than an adult. This buyer is listed in the ledger's cipher notation as someone who paid above market rate and required no documentation. The name, when Hartwell located it in the Charleston records, belonged to a man who had served as a county commissioner during the 1850s and who was, as of 1869, still alive, now serving on the board of a charitable society that had been established in 1866 to assist formerly enslaved people in finding employment. Hartwell did not publish this finding. He did not take it to any court. The legal framework for addressing transactions that had been illegal even under antebellum law, conducted by men who were now protected by both time and social position, was essentially non-existent in 1869 South Carolina. To bring such a finding forward publicly would have required a political will that was, in that particular moment of Reconstruction, being actively dismantled. What he did instead was write it all down. He compiled a comprehensive document, a synthesis of the parallel ledger, the cipher key, the letter fragments, the bureau records, and his own research findings, that he titled, with a lawyer's dry precision, A Record of Certain Transactions and Their Documentation, Harlow Hall Plantation, South Carolina, 1845-1863. He made 3 copies. One he kept. One he sent to a colleague at a law firm in Boston who had expressed interest in the legal questions raised by the post-war period. And one, the original documents themselves, along with a summary of his findings, he sent to an address in Philadelphia that Prentice had located through a separate chain of inquiry. The address belonged to a woman named Constance Lyle, who operated a small school for the education of black children in the 7th Ward. Prentice had found her name through a contact at the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, which had not formally dissolved after the war, but had redirected its efforts toward education and legal advocacy. Someone at the society, someone Prentice described in a letter to Hartwell only as a woman who seemed to know exactly what I was describing before I finished describing it, had given him Constance Lyle's name and address. He had not known, when he sent the documents, whether they would mean anything to her. He had not known whether Nora Hale had ever been in contact with the Philadelphia community, or whether the records sent there would find anyone who could make use of them. The letter he received back from Constance Lyle arrived 6 weeks later. It was brief. It said only that she had received the materials and would ensure they reached the people they concerned. It gave no further details. It was signed at the bottom, in a hand that Prentice recognized from the parallel ledger. Not Constance Lyle's hand, someone else's. Prentice stared at that signature for a long time. He had last seen that handwriting on papers that had been hidden inside a wall for years, perhaps decades. Papers that had been concealed so thoroughly that their discovery had required the complete dismantling of the room around them. And now, the same hand had signed a letter in his parlor in South Carolina in 1869, as though the wall had never existed. He wrote back immediately. His letter asked only one question: are the families being found? The answer arrived 3 months later. It was not a letter. It was a list, 4 pages, handwritten, with names and locations for 43 individuals whose whereabouts had been unknown to their families since the transactions recorded in the parallel ledger. Some had been located in Georgia, in Alabama, in Mississippi. Several had been found within South Carolina itself, in counties less than 100 miles from Harlow Hall. 3 had died, their deaths confirmed through bureau records and local testimony. 11 could not yet be located. At the bottom of the list, beneath the final name, was a single line that functioned simultaneously as a conclusion and as an indictment. This is what they thought they had destroyed. Prentice kept his silence about the documents for 2 years after that list arrived. This was not cowardice, though there were men in his position who would have burned everything out of straightforward self-interest. The documents were not legally his. They had been left in the walls by people whose descendants he was now in contact with, and their disposition was not properly his to decide. And the political climate in South Carolina in the early 1870s was not one in which documents of this kind could be introduced into any public forum without significant risk to the people they concerned. Reconstruction was collapsing. The federal presence in the South that had, for a brief period, created a framework within which formerly enslaved people had exercised political rights and held public office was being systematically dismantled by campaigns of terror and fraud that were official in everything but name. The men who had purchased children at Harlow Hall were not worried about being called to account. They were, in several cases, in positions of renewed authority. It was in this context, in the autumn of 1871, that a man came to Harlow Hall looking for Gerald Prentice. He arrived without advance notice on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and he was accompanied by 2 other men who waited in the road while he walked to the house. He introduced himself to Prentice's housekeeper, a local woman named Agnes, as a representative of the Hargrove family interests, and he asked to speak with the owner of the property. Prentice was in the East Wing when Agnes came to find him. She relayed the man's introduction in a flat, careful voice that told Prentice everything he needed to know about her reading of the situation. He went to meet the visitor. The man's name was Thane. He gave only the single name, which may or may not have been his actual name. He was well-dressed, approximately 50 years old, with the particular confidence of a man accustomed to having his requests interpreted as directives. He spoke pleasantly and without overt threat. He said that he had been made aware through mutual acquaintances that Mr. Prentice had discovered certain materials during the renovation of the property, and that these materials were of a sensitive nature. He said that the Hargrove family, and he used that phrase several times, the Hargrove family, had a natural interest in ensuring that private family correspondence did not find its way into circulation. He said that he would be happy to relieve Mr. Prentice of the burden of storing such materials, and that a suitable arrangement could certainly be reached. Prentice listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he told Thane that the materials he was describing had already been transferred to a secure location outside South Carolina, that copies existed in multiple hands, and that any attempt to recover or suppress them would have the opposite of the intended effect. Thane's pleasantness did not change, but something in his expression shifted, a very small recalibration, like a man updating a calculation. He said he would convey Mr. Prentice's position to the relevant parties. He thanked Prentice for his time. He walked back to the road, spoke briefly with the 2 men waiting there, and left. Prentice wrote to Hartwell that same evening. He wrote to Constance Lyle the following morning. He did not sleep well for several weeks after that. What Thane's visit had confirmed, what Prentice had already suspected, but had not known with certainty until that afternoon, was that someone connected to the Hargrove family's former interests had known about the materials for some time, not since Prentice had begun sending documents north. Before that, the visit had come too quickly, with too much specific knowledge to have been assembled from information gathered after the documents left South Carolina, which meant that someone had known about the parallel ledger while it was still inside the wall. The implications of this were not at first obvious. It took Prentice several days in consultation with Hartwell by correspondence to work through what it meant. If someone had known about the ledger's existence, had known it was hidden, known it documented the unrecorded transactions, and had not destroyed it, had simply left it there when the property was sold, then one of two things was true. Either the knowledge had been held by someone who wanted the ledger found by whoever bought the house, or it had been held by someone who was afraid to destroy it, who understood that the information in it was known to people outside the walls of Harlow Hall, and who feared that its destruction would not suppress the record, but only confirm their awareness of it. Warren Hargrove had sold the estate in March of 1869. He had been living on it, managing it, since the end of the war in 1865. He had spent 4 years as the sole occupant of a house whose walls contained a detailed record of crimes committed on his family's property. Crimes that implicated, directly and by name, men who were still alive and still connected to the social and political infrastructure of South Carolina. Had he found the ledger himself? Had someone told him it was there? Hartwell traveled to Savannah in the spring of 1872 to find out. Warren Hargrove agreed to meet him, which surprised Hartwell. He had expected to be refused. Instead, Hargrove received him in a sitting room in the boarding house where he was then living, a modest space that represented a considerable decline from the world of Harlow Hall, and poured him a glass of whiskey without being asked. Hartwell asked his questions directly. He was a lawyer. He did not believe in circling the point. Hargrove was silent for a long time after the last question. He looked at the glass in his hand, rather than at Hartwell. When he finally spoke, he said, "I found it in 1866 in January. I'd been trying to fix the stove in the kitchen passage, and a section of the plaster came away. I read what I could. I understood what it was." Hartwell asked what he had done with that knowledge. Hargrove said, "Nothing." Hartwell asked why. Hargrove said, "Because she was already gone. And because if I had told anyone, the people whose names were in there, the buyers, they'd have burned the house to the ground, with me in it most likely." Hartwell asked whether that was the reason he had sold the property. Another long silence. Then, "I sold it because I couldn't live in it. I would wake up at 3 in the morning and I could hear the house, not sounds, not settling or wind. I could hear, I knew what was in the walls. I knew what it meant, and I could not stop knowing." Hartwell asked him one final question. Had he sold the property to Prentice specifically, or had Prentice simply been the first willing buyer? Hargrove looked up from his glass for the first time during the conversation. His expression was difficult to read, something between guilt and a very old, very tired form of calculation. He said, "I made inquiries, before I listed it, about the sort of man he was." Hartwell returned to Philadelphia with his notes and the full weight of what he now understood. Warren Hargrove had not sold Harlow Hall to escape his debts. He had sold it because he had found the ledger and had understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent 4 years alone in a house full of evidence, that the only way to ensure the documents survived was to put them in the hands of someone who would not destroy them. Someone from outside the South. Someone with enough distance from the system to read what the records contained without needing to suppress them. He had engineered the discovery. Not out of guilt, exactly. Not out of justice, exactly. Out of something more complicated and more human than either. A recognition that the ledger's existence was not his burden to carry and not his right to bury, and that the only moral act available to him was to create the conditions under which someone else could make a decision he was incapable of making himself. Whether this made Warren Hargrove a coward or something approaching a collaborator in the ledger's survival was a question Hartwell never answered definitively. He laid out the facts. He let the questions stand. The document that Hartwell published in 1874, not a legal brief, not a court filing, but a historical monograph distributed through a small press in Boston, was titled Hidden Record: The Harlow Hall Documents and the Unregistered Trade in South Carolina, 1845-1863. It contained a full transcription of the parallel ledger, with the cipher key explained, and a summary of the research conducted between 1869 and 1873. It named names where names were known. It documented transactions where transactions could be traced. It did not produce any legal action. The men named in it as buyers were, by 1874, either dead or sufficiently protected by the political landscape of Reconstruction's collapse to be beyond reach. The county commissioner who had purchased children from Harlow Hall above market rate, he had died in 1871, before Hartwell's monograph was complete. Whether this was fortunate for him or simply the natural end of a long life was a matter of perspective. The monograph sold fewer than 300 copies in its first year. It was reviewed in 2 northern newspapers and 1 abolitionist journal, all favorably. In South Carolina, it was not reviewed at all. Gerald Prentice never converted Harlow Hall into what he had imagined when he bought it. The renovations continued sporadically through the 1870s, but the ambition of the original project, to transform the estate into something modern, something clean, never quite materialized. He sold the property in 1878 at a small loss to a timber company that was primarily interested in the acreage rather than the house. The house itself stood empty for several years before being damaged by a fire of undetermined origin in 1883. It was not rebuilt. The parallel ledger, the original document, was retained by Constance Lyle's school in Philadelphia until 1891, when it was transferred to a historically black college in the South at the request of a woman who had been a student at the school in the 1870s. The transfer was accompanied by a letter written in a hand that, by 1891, had grown slightly unsteady with age, but was still unmistakably the same hand that had maintained the record for 15 years inside a wall at Harlow Hall, and had signed the letter to Gerald Prentice in 1869, and had sent the list of 43 names across the distance between what had been hidden and what was, at last, beginning to be known. Nora Hale's final letter, written alongside the ledger's transfer, was brief. She did not explain what she had done or why. She did not ask to be thanked or remembered. She said only that the record was complete, that every name she had been able to account for had been accounted for, and that the 11 who had not been found in 1869 had, in the 20 years since, been reduced to 3. That 3 remained unknown was, she wrote, not a failure. It is a remaining obligation. She signed her name. She gave no date. The ledger entered the college's archive and remained there, largely unexamined, for decades. And that is where the story might have ended. In an archive shelf, in a building that most people would never visit, holding a record that most people would never read. But records do not end simply because the people who created them are gone. In the spring of 1924, a history professor at the college was cataloging materials in the archive when he opened a box that had not been opened in 20 years. He found the ledger. He found the cipher key. He found Nora Hale's letter, tucked inside the front cover. He spent 3 months with the materials before he published anything, and when he did, in a small journal of American history, in a modest article that attracted little attention at the time, he closed his essay with a sentence that has stayed in the margins of the historical record ever since. The most remarkable thing about the Harlow Hall record, he wrote, is not what it documents. It is the evidence it provides of the systematic, sustained, and entirely clandestine effort by enslaved people to maintain knowledge of their own history in conditions designed specifically to prevent them from doing so. These documents were not created for posterity. They were created for the people they named. They were hidden, not to be discovered by strangers, but to be found by those who were meant to find them. And then, when circumstance made that impossible, they waited, with the patient authority of all things that refused to be entirely erased, for whoever came next. The walls of Harlow Hall are gone now. The timber company that bought the land in 1878 dismantled whatever the fire of 1883 had left standing, and the earth where the house once sat has long since been reclaimed by the low Carolina scrub that grows across everything in that region if left undisturbed for long enough. There is no marker. There is no sign. But in an archive in the south, in a building that was built specifically to hold the history that the official record refused to carry, the ledger still exists. The names in it are still legible. The cipher is still readable. The tally marks on the wall of the sealed room are gone with the house, but the record of their existence is not. They do not know we keep count. They were right. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was finally revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this account and want more forgotten stories from American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves the truth hidden behind closed doors. See you in the next story.